In 1952, police arrested British Cabinet Minister Alan Lennox Boyd for soliciting men in a London railway station. This is the reality behind the most sickening Viscount Boyd rough trade arrest. While ordinary citizens faced chemical castration for these exact actions, Prime Minister Winston Churchill illegally ordered the police ledgers burned, granting Boyd total immunity to rule the empire. In early 1950s Britain, the government compensated for a crumbling global empire by enforcing rigid moral conformity at home. Under Home Secretary Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, homosexuality became the primary target of an aggressive state-sponsored purge. Thousands of men faced relentless police surveillance, entrapment, and forced chemical castration. Under the direction of fierce conservatives like Home Secretary Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, the law was weaponized against the British public. This was not a passive background prejudice. It was an active, aggressive hunt. Thousands of ordinary men, teachers, clerks, factory workers, and decorated war veterans were subjected to relentless police surveillance. They faced entrapment in public bathrooms, complete public humiliation in the press, and devastating, life-ruining prison sentences. Many were forced by the courts into chemical castration. Others, broken by the shame and the total destruction of their livelihoods, were driven to suicide. The streets of London became an environment of sheer terror for anyone who did not fit the rigid, traditional mold of the time. The legal system was deployed as a merciless tool to crush the vulnerable and uphold a fragile facade of absolute decency. Yet high above the smog and the fear of the streets, an entirely different reality existed for the ruling class. The British aristocracy had spent centuries constructing an invisible fortress around themselves, a bubble of supreme privilege built on immense wealth, elite schooling, and interlocked bloodlines. In this rarefied air, the laws that destroyed commoners were often treated as mere suggestions or minor inconveniences. Alan Lennox Boyd was the quintessential product of this untouchable machinery. Born in 1904 into a family of substantial means and deep political influence, he walked the gilded, predetermined path of the elite, moving effortlessly from the prestigious halls of Sherborne School to Christ Church, Oxford. Standing and imposing 6 feet 5 inches tall, he was a man who physically dominated every room he entered. He possessed a booming charm, a sharp, unyielding intellect, and an absolute, unshakable confidence in his inherent right to rule over others. His ascent into the highest tiers of society was cemented not just by his aggressive political ambition, but by his highly strategic marriage into the Guinness brewing dynasty. By marrying Lady Patricia Guinness, Lennox Boyd wrapped himself in an armor of unimaginable generational wealth. This profound financial security allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of British politics with a level of independence and impunity that few of his peers could dream of. He was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament in 1931 at the remarkably young age of 27, and from that moment, his trajectory was steep and unrelenting. He established himself as a fiercely loyal defender of the traditional British order, a man who spoke eloquently and forcefully about duty, honor, and the civilizing mission of the empire. By the time Winston Churchill returned to the premiership in 1951, Lennox Boyd had proven himself to be an indispensable, rock-solid asset to the Conservative government. Churchill recognizing his commanding physical presence and his administrative ruthlessness, appointed him first as Minister of State for Colonial Affairs, and soon after elevated him to the massive historic role of Secretary of State for the colonies. In this capacity, Lennox Boyd was no longer just a politician debating domestic policy. He was an imperial overlord. From his heavily guarded oak-paneled office in Whitehall, he held absolute authority over territories stretching from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia. He made daily life and death decisions during some of the most violent and critical crises of the era, dictating brutal military responses to uprisings and managing the complex, bloody retreat of the British Empire on the global stage. By day, he was the stern, uncompromising voice of the British government. He stood confidently at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, defending the strict laws and morals of the empire, representing the very system that was simultaneously hunting down and destroying ordinary men for their private, consensual lives. He was surrounded by the crushing weight of global responsibility, constantly moving between high-stakes meetings with military generals, intelligence chiefs, the Prime Minister, and the Queen herself. His public life was a masterpiece of aristocratic dedication, a flawless, uninterrupted performance of a statesman carrying the heavy burden of the world on his expertly tailored shoulders. But the immense pressure of commanding nations, combined with the suffocating rigidity of his highly visible public persona, created a dangerous psychological fracture within him. While his cabinet colleagues spent their evenings winding down in the safe, exclusive sanctuaries of gentlemen's clubs, sipping scotch among their wealthy peers, the colonial secretary sought a vastly different, highly volatile release. As the sun set over London and the thick, coal-choked fog rolled in from the Thames, a profound transformation took place. The man who spent his days enforcing imperial order and strict legal compliance felt an insatiable, overwhelming compulsion to plunge directly into the chaos, danger, and gritty underbelly of the very city he ruled. He was actively preparing to cross a line that separated the untouchable elite rulers from the desperate, hunted masses of the streets, setting the stage for a violent collision that would test the absolute limits of British justice. When Lennox Boyd left the heavily guarded corridors of Whitehall, his routine shifted drastically. Stripping away his public persona, the colonial secretary actively sought the anonymity of London's transit hubs like Victoria Station. His target demographic was the working class, laborers and sailors, operating in stark contrast to his sterile, aristocratic environment. It was a calculated risk, built on the arrogant assumption that his position rendered him invisible to the very laws he enforced. But the streets of London in 1952 were actively hostile territory. The Home Office, driven by a paranoid fear of moral decay, had essentially declared war on homosexual men. The Metropolitan Police were under immense political pressure to produce arrests, to clean up the public spaces, and to crush the underground networks. To achieve this, Scotland Yard deployed aggressive, highly deceptive tactics. Plainclothes officers, often young and conventionally attractive, were sent into public lavatories, parks, and railway stations to act as decoys. They loitered in the shadows, mirroring the subtle, unspoken body language of cruising, a lingering glance, a shifted stance, the offering of a lit match. They waited for men to approach to make a proposition, and the moment the words were spoken, The trap snapped shut. On one particular evening, the precise date of which has been carefully scrubbed from the official archives, Lennox Boyd's luck finally ran out. Navigating the damp, echoing concourse of a major London railway station, his attention was drawn to a young man lingering near a designated cruising spot. The environment was tense, filled with the hiss of steam trains and the hurried footsteps of late commuters. Lennox Boyd, operating on the dangerous confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy or command his way out of, made his approach. The subtle choreography of the encounter played out exactly as it had 100 times before. A look was exchanged. The distance between them closed. Words were muttered quietly in the shadows, a clear, undeniable proposition. The response was not what the colonial secretary expected. There was no negotiation, no transactional nod of agreement. Instead, the young man's demeanor instantly hardened. In a flash of terrifying reality, the decoy dropped his act, and the heavy hands of the law grabbed the aristocratic giant. Other plainclothes officers materialized from the surrounding gloom surrounding him, physically restraining him. For the first time in his exceptionally privileged life, Alan Lennox Boyd was subjected to the brute, uncompromising force of the state. He was manhandled, told to keep his mouth shut, and placed under arrest for importuning for immoral purposes. The irony of the moment was absolute and devastating. The officers, gripping his arms, pushing him toward a waiting police vehicle, were working-class men, the exact demographic he had been seeking out for pleasure. They were foot soldiers of the establishment, enforcing a moral code that had been dictated by the very cabinet in which Lennox Boyd served. As the doors of the police van slammed shut, plunging him into darkness, the colonial secretary was forcefully reduced to the status of a common criminal. He was transported through the streets he governed, not in a chauffeur-driven Bentley, but in the caged back of a paddy wagon, facing the total unmitigated destruction of his existence. When he arrived at the local police precinct, the routine machinery of justice began to grind forward. The station was a grim, unforgiving place, smelling of harsh carbolic soap and cold sweat. He was hauled before the desk sergeant, standing beneath the glaring, unforgiving overhead lights. The officers, flushed with the success of a routine vice arrest, treated him with the standard callous disdain reserved for men caught in such sting operations. They demanded he empty his pockets. They demanded his name, his address, and his occupation, ready to write the details into the permanent ledger that would guarantee his appearance in court and his subsequent slaughter in the morning newspapers. This was the absolute point of no return. Lennox Boyd stood at the desk, towering over the officers, completely stripped of his anonymity. He knew the protocol. He knew that the moment he spoke his true name, he would detonate a political bomb capable of bringing down Winston Churchill's government. The press would feast on the scandal. The married aristocrat, the champion of imperial morals, caught prowling the gutters for young men. The hypocrisy would be a global spectacle. He could have lied. He could have given a false name and hoped to post bail before anyone checked his fingerprints. But he also understood the lethal danger of perjury and the sheer impossibility of hiding a face that was regularly photographed alongside the Queen. Slowly abandoning his disguise, he drew himself up to his full intimidating height. the booming, authoritative voice that routinely commanded generals and diplomats returned. He did not give a false name. He reached into his belongings and produced his official identification. The desk sergeant took the document, his eyes scanning the thick embossed card. The bustling noise of the police station seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, chilling silence. The sergeant looked from the card to the towering patrician face of the man standing before him, then back to the card. The name was impossible to misinterpret. The title was a hammer blow to the officer's reality. They were not booking a nameless vagrant or a desperate clerk. The man they had just manhandled, insulted, and threatened with prison was the Right Honorable Alan Lennox Boyd, Secretary of State for the Colonies. He was a senior minister of the Crown, a personal confidant of the Prime Minister, and one of the most powerful men in the world. The standard procedures of British law instantly broke down. The arresting officers, previously confident and aggressive, were suddenly paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. They realized with horrifying clarity that they had caught the wrong kind of criminal. They had snared a predator who outranked their chief commissioner, their mayor, and their local judges. The law they were hired to enforce was a rigid, merciless machine designed to crush the poor and the unprotected. It was fundamentally not built to process the arrest of a ruling aristocrat. The sergeant did not write the name in the public ledger. Instead, he carefully placed the pen down, picked up the telephone, and initiated a frantic chain of communication that bypassed the local courts entirely, reaching directly into the dark, insulated heart of the British establishment. The survival of the government was now at stake, and the law was about to be rewritten in the dead of night. The telephone call from that grim, carbolic-smelling police station did not travel through the standard channels of justice. It bypassed the local magistrates, leaped over the standard chain of command at Scotland Yard, and shot straight up into the insulated, deeply paranoid stratosphere of the British government. Within hours, the news reached the heavy black door of 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, was abruptly awoken to a crisis that threatened to completely detonate his administration. To understand Churchill's reaction, you must understand the perilous tightrope the British government was walking in 1952. The Cold War was freezing over, the empire was bleeding out in costly colonial brushfires, and the conservative government was clinging to power with a razor-thin margin. The absolute last thing the Prime Minister could afford was a catastrophic, globally publicized moral scandal involving one of his most senior cabinet ministers. If the Secretary of State for the Colonies was put in the dock for cruising a public railway station for rough trade, the political fallout would be apocalyptic. The opposition would tear the government to shreds, international allies would question Britain's stability, and the carefully curated illusion of imperial superiority would shatter. Churchill was a man of supreme pragmatism, possessing a worldview forged in the bloody machinery of war and high-stakes statecraft. He was known to possess a remarkably cynical, almost dismissive tolerance for the private sexual eccentricities of his aristocratic peers, famously quipping about a similar scandal with a dark, aristocratic humor. But this was not a matter of private amusement. This was a matter of state survival. His political calculus was ruthless, instantaneous, and entirely devoid of any concern for the actual rule of law. The British Empire could not afford the fall of Alan Lennox Boyd. Therefore, Alan Lennox Boyd would not fall. What unfolded in the pre-dawn hours of London was a masterclass in institutional corruption, a chilling demonstration of how the state can weaponize its own shadows to protect its masters. The heavy machinery of British intelligence and domestic security, usually reserved for hunting Soviet spies or crushing colonial rebellions, was turned inward. Men in immaculate suits, senior fixers from the Home Office and Special Branch, descended upon the local police precinct. The atmosphere in the station transformed instantly from the routine boredom of a night shift to a state of absolute suffocating terror for the arresting officers. The young plainclothes policemen who only hours before believed they had executed a successful textbook vice sting were pulled into a closed room. There were no congratulations. Instead, they were subjected to immediate, brutal intimidation. They were reminded of the Official Secrets Act. They were told in no uncertain terms that their careers, their pensions, and their very freedom depended on their total unbroken silence. The event they had witnessed, the arrest they had made, simply did not happen. The physical mechanics of the cover-up were astonishingly brazen. The official arrest logs, the heavy bound ledgers that represented the unalterable record of British justice, were confiscated. The pages containing Lennox Boyd's name, his alleged crime, and the time of his booking were physically removed and fed into incinerators. All physical evidence of the night's events was burned to ash. The law, which the government championed as the unbreakable foundation of society, was treated as nothing more than a minor clerical error to be erased with a match. Simultaneously, a suffocating blanket of silence was thrown over Fleet Street. In an era before the internet, the government held immense power over the flow of information. An ironclad D-notice, an official government directive demanding total press silence on matters of national security, was quietly issued to the editors of every major newspaper in the country. The press barons of the 1950s were deeply intertwined with the political elite, members of the same exclusive clubs and alumni of the same private schools. They understood the rules of the game. Despite holding a story that would have sold millions of papers, they happily complied. The printing presses rolled, but not a single drop of ink was spent on the colonial secretary's midnight arrest. As the sun rose over a smog-choked London, Alan Lennox Boyd was quietly escorted out of a side door of the police station. He had spent the night staring into the abyss of total ruin, only to have the abyss paved over by the Prime Minister himself. He stepped into a waiting, unmarked government car, smoothed the wrinkles from his expensive suit, and was driven away. The psychological whiplash must have been staggering, yet he possessed the chilling sociopathic calm required of the ruling class. By mid-morning, he was sitting back behind his massive oak desk at the Colonial Office, reviewing dispatch boxes and issuing orders that would dictate the lives of millions across the globe, entirely shielded from the justice system that would have mercilessly destroyed any man without his title. While Lennox Boyd returned to his desk at the Colonial Office entirely unscathed, the justice system proceeded to execute its mandate on those lacking executive protection. On that exact same morning, hundreds of ordinary men arrested under identical circumstances faced public exposure, termination of employment, and prison sentences. The survival of Alan Lennox Boyd was not a victory for tolerance. It was the ultimate sickening triumph of the elite standard. It was a clear, undeniable broadcast to the ruling class that the laws they passed to control the populace did not apply to them. They were gods walking among mortals, capable of commanding the police to vanish, the press to go blind, and the truth to burn. As Lennox Boyd settled back into his role as a supreme architect of the British Empire, he carried a dark, explosive secret, a secret that would paradoxically fuel his ruthless political ambitions as he prepared to oversee one of the most violent and bloody chapters in the history of British colonial rule. The morning after Winston Churchill erased his arrest from the annals of British history, Alan Lennox Boyd arrived at the Colonial Office in Whitehall exactly as he always did. There was no visible tremor in his hands as he stepped out of his chauffeur-driven car, no hesitation in his stride as he walked past the armed guards who snapped to attention at his presence. He was immaculately dressed, his towering frame projecting the absolute unyielding authority of the British Empire. To the secretaries, the civil servants, and the foreign diplomats waiting in the anteroom, he was the picture of aristocratic composure. Yet the psychological compartmentalization required to perform this role, mere hours after facing total annihilation in a squalid police cell, borders on the unfathomable. He sat behind his massive leather-topped desk surrounded by maps of the world where vast territories were colored in imperial pink. In front of him were the red dispatch boxes containing the deepest secrets and the most urgent crises of the British government. As he opened these boxes and began reading reports, signing orders, and dictating memos, the sheer staggering hypocrisy of his existence crystallized. The man holding the pen, the man deciding the fates of millions of colonial subjects under the banner of British law, order, and civilization, was a man who knew intimately that British law was a highly flexible fiction. He knew that the system he was currently administrating was not a blind, impartial scale of justice, but a weapon that could be holstered or drawn depending entirely on the bloodline and bank account of the target. This realization forces us to examine the terrifying intersection of private vice and public brutality. How does a man, fully aware of his own criminal vulnerability and the state's willingness to suspend the law to protect him, govern others? For Lennox Boyd, the near-death experience of his arrest did not lead to an epiphany of mercy or a softening of his political stances. Instead, the total impunity granted to him by Churchill seemed to harden his resolve, insulating him further from the consequences of his actions. He was untouchable, and he proceeded to govern with the ruthless confidence of a man who believed the rules of human consequence simply did not apply to his class. During his tenure as Secretary of State for the Colonies, which began in earnest in 1954, Lennox Boyd oversaw some of the most violent, legally dubious, and morally catastrophic episodes of the declining British Empire. The most glaring of these was his handling of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. While the British public was being fed a narrative of a civilized, benevolent empire battling savage terrorists, the reality on the ground was a nightmare of state-sponsored terror. To crush the rebellion, the British colonial administration, under Lennox Boyd's ultimate authority, implemented a massive system of detention camps, often referred to by historians today as the pipeline. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu people were systematically uprooted from their homes and forced into these camps without trial, without due process, and without any of the legal protections guaranteed by British law. The reports filtering back to the Colonial Office in London detailed horrifying abuses, systemic torture, starvation, forced labor, and summary executions carried out by colonial security forces and loyalist militias. These were not rogue actions by isolated units. They were part of a systemic, brutal strategy of subjugation designed to break the psychological will of an entire population. As the colonial secretary, Lennox Boyd was the ultimate recipient of these reports. He stood at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, defending the actions of the colonial administration, obfuscating the truth, and denying the systemic nature of the abuses. He deployed the brilliant, articulate rhetoric of his Oxford education to justify the suspension of civil liberties in Kenya, arguing that extreme measures were necessary to restore order and protect the realm. The historical whiplash of this reality is profoundly, deeply disturbing. Here was a man who only a short time prior was caught breaking the law in a London railway station, an act for which working-class men were being chemically castrated and driven to suicide. He was saved only because the Prime Minister decided to violently subvert the justice system. Yet this same man, saved by a total disregard for the law, became the chief architect and defender of a colonial system that suspended the law to imprison, torture, and murder thousands of Africans. He utilized the exact same machinery of state secrecy, D-notices, and political cover-ups that had saved his own life in London to shield the colonial administration in Kenya from public scrutiny and international condemnation. This is the grim, unvarnished reality of the elite standard. The cover-up of his arrest did not just save a politician's career, it preserved a man who would go on to enable and defend atrocities on a global scale. The disconnect is not merely hypocritical, it is sociopathic. It requires an individual to view humanity through a violently distorted lens. Where the sexual indiscretions of an aristocrat are deemed vital state secrets worthy of prime ministerial intervention, while the torture and death of thousands of colonial subjects are dismissed as administrative necessities. Did the memory of his night in the police station ever haunt him as he signed off on the detention orders for the Kenyan camps? Did he ever recognize the agonizing parallel between the plainclothes police officers who hunted him in the shadows of Victoria Station and the colonial security forces hunting Kikuyu fighters in the forests of the Aberdares? The historical record suggests absolute silence on his part. There are no diaries expressing a crisis of conscience, no letters detailing a struggle with his own hypocrisy. The aristocratic armor held firm. He compartmentalized his illicit desires from his imperial duties with the cold mechanical efficiency of a man completely convinced of his own inherent superiority. The tragedy deepens when we consider the culture of the British Parliament during this era. The House of Commons was a highly aggressive, deeply combative arena, yet it operated on a rigid code of gentlemanly conduct that frequently prioritized class solidarity over moral accountability. There were certainly rumors circulating within the quiet corners of the Westminster tea rooms and the smoky recesses of the Carlton Club. Whispers of the colonial secretary's nighttime excursions, of the destroyed police ledger, and of Churchill's furious midnight intervention were traded among the most senior figures of the establishment. Yet no one spoke out. The political opposition, which could have used the scandal to destroy the Conservative government, remained entirely silent. This silence was not born out of respect for Lennox Boyd, but out of a collective, desperate need to protect the illusion of the ruling class. To expose Lennox Boyd was to expose the entire rotting foundation of the establishment. It would force the public to confront the horrifying reality that their leaders were not the morally upright, superior beings they claimed to be, but flawed, compromised men operating above the laws they rigidly enforced upon everyone else. The silence of Parliament was a complicit agreement to maintain the charade, to protect the club, even as that same club authorized the brutalization of ordinary citizens at home and colonial subjects abroad. The secret of the railway station became a shared, toxic bond among the elite, a dark pact that reinforced their mutual invulnerability. To grasp the full measure of this institutional rot, we must look at what happened to those who lacked Alan Lennox Boyd's political utility. The profound injustice of his secret pardon becomes infinitely darker when placed directly alongside the very public, state-sponsored destruction of other men during the exact same period. While the colonial secretary sat safely behind his desk, shielded by the Prime Minister's invisible hand, the British government unleashed a terrifying purge that culminated in one of the most notorious legal spectacles of the 20th century, the 1954 trial of Lord Montague of Beaulieu, Michael Pitt Rivers, and Peter Wildblood. At first glance, Lord Montague shared much of Lennox Boyd's aristocratic armor. He was young, titled, wealthy, and moved in the highest circles of British society. Yet, when Montague and his friends were accused of homosexual offenses, the state did not intervene to save them. The Home Office, the police, and the courts descended upon them with a ferocity designed to make an unforgettable public example. Their homes were raided, their private letters were confiscated and read aloud in court, and the press was given unrestricted access to publish every humiliating detail of their private lives. They were aggressively prosecuted, convicted, and thrown into prison. Peter Wildblood, a talented journalist, was sentenced to 18 months of hard labor, a harrowing ordeal that broke his health and permanently scarred his life. The 1954 prosecution of Lord Montague of Beaulieu reveals the cold transactional nature of establishment power. Unlike Lennox Boyd, Montague lacked the political utility required to trigger a state intervention. Expendable to the Conservative administration, Montague and his associates were aggressively prosecuted and served as highly publicized sacrificial lambs to satisfy the public demand for moral order. Imagine the sheer chilling sociopathy required to navigate this reality. During the sensational trials of 1954, every newspaper in Britain was splashed with lurid headlines about the evils of homosexuality. The public was consumed by the scandal. In the House of Commons, debates raged about moral decay and the necessity of harsh prison sentences. And sitting right there on the government front bench was Alan Lennox Boyd. He watched his peers being destroyed by the very laws he had broken. He listened to the speeches condemning men to prison, knowing with absolute certainty that he belonged in a cell right next to them. Yet he said nothing. He did not advocate for leniency. He did not leverage his massive political influence to stop the witch hunt. He preserved his own skin by remaining entirely complicit in the destruction of others, perfectly maintaining the facade of the outraged, morally upright statesman. This capacity for absolute compartmentalization, the ability to divorce his own actions from the brutal consequences he imposed on others, eventually reached its devastating climax, not in the public bathrooms of London, but in the dusty, blood-soaked soil of East Africa. By 1959, Lennox Boyd's colonial administration in Kenya was desperately trying to contain the Mau Mau uprising. The system of detention camps he had overseen had grown into a monstrous, uncontrollable apparatus of violence. The breaking point occurred at a facility known as the Hola Detention Camp. In March of 1959, British colonial guards and loyalist forces enacted a policy of forced labor at Hola. When a group of political detainees refused to work, asserting their rights, the camp administration authorized the use of extreme physical force. What followed was a massacre. The guards descended on the unarmed prisoners with clubs, beating them mercilessly. 11 men were bludgeoned to death. Dozens more were left with permanently crippling injuries. The horrific reality of the imperial project, so often hidden behind polite parliamentary language, was suddenly laid bare. The immediate reaction of the colonial government was a desperate, transparent attempt at a cover-up. The official statement released to the public claimed that the 11 men had died after drinking contaminated water. It was a lie of staggering arrogance, reminiscent of the destroyed police ledgers in London. But this time, the bodies could not be incinerated like pieces of paper. The truth bled out. Autopsies proved that the men had died from massive trauma, shattered skulls, and broken limbs. The contaminated water lie collapsed, triggering a monumental political scandal in London. The Hola massacre forced Alan Lennox Boyd to stand before the House of Commons and answer for the atrocities committed under his absolute authority. The man who had escaped justice in the shadows was now forced to defend the indefensible in the blinding light of public scrutiny. He deployed every political maneuver he had learned. He attempted to distance the London office from the actions on the ground, minimizing the systemic nature of the violence and blaming rogue elements. He argued the brutal necessity of maintaining imperial order, but the defense rang hollow. The barbarity of the empire had finally pierced the carefully constructed illusion of civilizing grace. It was during these debates that the Conservative Member of Parliament Enoch Powell delivered a blistering historic speech condemning the government's actions, stating that Britain could not have one standard of justice for its own citizens and a lesser standard for Africans. The irony buried deep beneath the political rhetoric was profound. Powell was arguing against a double standard of justice across the empire, entirely unaware that the man he was holding responsible, the colonial secretary himself, existed as the ultimate embodiment of a double standard of justice within Britain itself. The Hola massacre irreparably damaged the moral standing of the colonial administration and accelerated the end of the British Empire in Africa. Yet even in the face of 11 murdered men and a botched state cover-up, the establishment's instinct to protect its own held firm. Lennox Boyd was battered by the press and the opposition, but he was not fired. He was not prosecuted for gross negligence or complicity in war crimes. The system absorbed the shock. He remained in his post until the general election later that year. When he finally decided to step down in 1959, he did not leave in disgrace. He was not led away in handcuffs. He orchestrated his departure on his own terms. He cited a desire to return to the private sector and manage the immense corporate interests of the Guinness family. He transitioned smoothly from the pinnacle of global political power to the pinnacle of corporate wealth, leaving the wreckage of ruined lives and broken bodies far behind him. When a politician's career ends in the shadow of a massacre, the expected trajectory is one of public disgrace, historical exile, or at the very least, a quiet, ashamed retreat into obscurity. The Hola detention camp scandal, with its shattered skulls and exposed government lies, should have been the definitive ruinous end of Alan Lennox Boyd. He had overseen an administration that sanctioned absolute brutality, and the political blood was undeniably on his hands. But the British establishment does not easily discard its most loyal architects. When Lennox Boyd stepped down in 1959, he did not step into the wilderness. He stepped onto an escalator that carried him even higher into the untouchable stratosphere of the British elite. In 1960, the man who had been secretly arrested in a London railway station for a criminal sex offense, the man who had subsequently overseen one of the most violent crackdowns in colonial history, was officially elevated to the peerage. He was granted a hereditary title by the Queen, becoming the first Viscount Boyd of Merton. This was not a mere medal or a polite pension. This was the ultimate validation of the state. To truly understand the stomach-turning irony of this moment, you must picture the ceremony in the House of Lords. Imagine Lennox Boyd, standing 6 feet 5 inches tall, draped in the heavy scarlet and ermine robes of a viscount, swearing an oath of allegiance to the crown. He was being formally enshrined as a pillar of British morality and constitutional order. Yet, the ghost of his past, the terrified desk sergeant, the burned arrest ledgers, the suffocating midnight cover-up ordered by Winston Churchill, stood right there with him, invisible to the public, but undeniably present in the quiet, knowing glances exchanged among the oldest members of the establishment. His elevation to the House of Lords provided him with a permanent, unelected platform to influence British law for the rest of his life. But Viscount Boyd's ambitions were no longer confined to the decaying halls of Westminster. Having managed the slow, bloody liquidation of the British Empire, he seamlessly transitioned his ruthless administrative skills into the private sector. He returned to the warm, heavily fortified embrace of his wife's family dynasty, the Guinness Brewing Empire. He took on the role of managing director of Arthur Guinness Son and Company, trading the red dispatch boxes of Whitehall for the mahogany boardrooms of international corporate finance. In many ways, his life as a corporate titan was a mirror image of his life as an imperial overlord. He was still making decisions that affected thousands of workers, still operating in a deeply insulated environment of extreme wealth, and still entirely shielded from the daily struggles of the ordinary public. He spent his days expanding the Guinness market share, traveling extensively, and enjoying the fruits of a staggeringly lucrative corporate career. He purchased magnificent estates, hosted lavish society parties, and cemented his family's legacy among the wealthiest in the nation. It was a life of absolute, unbothered luxury, completely divorced from the wreckage he had left behind in East Africa, and utterly removed from the terror that still gripped the underground homosexual communities of London. While Viscount Boyd was drinking vintage champagne in the executive suites of the Guinness Empire, the political landscape of Britain was beginning to violently fracture. The 1960s brought a seismic shift in culture, a sudden aggressive challenging of the old aristocratic order that had protected him. In 1963, the Profumo affair ripped through the conservative government. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, was caught in an illicit affair with a young model, Christine Keeler, and subsequently lied about it to the House of Commons. When the truth emerged, the press, which had obediently remained silent for Lennox Boyd a decade earlier, absolutely eviscerated Profumo. The unwritten rules of elite protection were breaking down. Profumo was forced to resign in total disgrace, his career annihilated, his reputation permanently destroyed. One can only imagine what Viscount Boyd was thinking as he watched the Profumo scandal unfold from the safe distance of the House of Lords. Profumo was destroyed for lying about a consensual heterosexual affair. Boyd had been arrested for a criminal vice offense, and his survival was secured by a massive illegal state cover-up involving the Prime Minister and the intelligence services. The difference between their fates was not a matter of morality. It was a matter of timing and absolute ruthless power. Churchill had possessed the immense authority required to bend the state to his will and crush the press into silence. By the 1960s, that era of unquestioned dictatorial control over the media was ending. Boyd had slipped through the closing doors of history just in time. He was a relic of a bygone era of total impunity, watching the new generation of politicians burn for sins far lesser than his own. But perhaps the most profound and emotionally devastating contrast of his later years lies in the changing legal status of the very men he used to hunt in the shadows. By the late 1960s, the horrific injustices of the state-sponsored homophobic purges could no longer be ignored. The Wolfenden Report, which had been published years earlier, finally gained political traction. Courageous politicians and activists fought a grueling, deeply unpopular battle to decriminalize homosexuality. The debates in Parliament were fierce, filled with the same vitriolic, prejudiced rhetoric that had defined the 1950s. In 1967, the Sexual Offenses Act was finally passed, partially decriminalizing homosexual acts in private between two men over the age of 21. It was a monumental, hard-won victory for basic human rights. But where was Viscount Boyd during this historic turning point? He was sitting in the House of Lords, a member of the upper chamber that had the power to debate, delay, or support this vital legislation. He was a man who knew better than anyone the sheer terror of being hunted by the police for one's sexuality. He knew the squalor of the holding cells, the panic of the arrest, and the devastating, life-ruining potential of the law. If there was ever a moment for him to use his immense privilege, his untouchable status, and his aristocratic voice to advocate for the vulnerable, this was it. He could have spoken out. He could have anonymously supported the reformers. He could have offered a sliver of empathy for the thousands of men whose lives had been destroyed while his had been miraculously saved. Instead, he maintained an absolute chilling silence. He did not champion the cause of the men he once sought out in the fog-choked docks of London. He remained comfortably hidden behind his title, his wealth, and his socially acceptable marriage. His silence was the ultimate betrayal of his own hidden reality. It cemented his legacy not just as a hypocrite, but as a man who viewed his own survival as a divine right, while viewing the suffering of others as entirely irrelevant. Viscount Boyd lived the rest of his life in a state of unblemished, state-sponsored glory. He became a patron of charities, a respected voice in conservative circles, and a beloved patriarch to his immensely wealthy family. He walked the streets of London, the very same streets where he was once handcuffed and dragged into the back of a police van, completely free of fear, consequence, or legal retribution. His life forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about the nature of power. Karma is often a myth we tell ourselves to make the world feel fair. In the real world, the man who breaks the law weaponizes the state to cover his tracks and oversees colonial atrocities, can and often does win the game entirely. As the decades rolled on, the Britain that Alan Lennox Boyd once ruled began to change beyond all recognition. The 1970s and early 1980s brought a wave of cultural revolution that dismantled much of the rigid, suffocating Victorian morality he had publicly championed and privately defied. The underground world of the East End docks and the shadowed corners of Victoria Station, where he once risked everything for a fleeting moment of rough trade, were slowly being replaced by a more open, visible, and defiant gay culture. Pride parades marched down the very streets where plainclothes police officers had once operated their entrapment stings. A new generation was loudly demanding the right to exist without fear, fighting to dismantle the very laws that the British establishment had used to terrorize them. Yet Viscount Boyd of Merton remained entirely insulated from this societal earthquake. He spent his twilight years enveloped in the absolute tranquility of immense wealth and unshakable privilege. He had successfully transitioned from the height of imperial politics to the absolute summit of global corporate power, guiding the massive Guinness brewing dynasty through changing economic times. When he finally retired to his sprawling country estate in Cornwall, he did so not as a man hiding from his past, but as a revered elder statesman. He spent his days managing his vast properties, sailing and receiving visits from the highest echelons of the Conservative Party. To the outside world, he was the picture of a life well lived, a dedicated servant of the crown, enjoying a well-earned, peaceful retirement. The profound injustice of this peaceful retirement is difficult to overstate. It is here that we must contrast his golden years with the fates of the men who were not saved by the Prime Minister. Consider the young men who were arrested in the same purges of the early 1950s. Those who survived the chemical castrations, the brutal prison sentences, and the total destruction of their careers did not get to retire to sprawling estates. Many lived out their days in poverty, deeply traumatized, carrying the permanent stigma of a criminal record that prevented them from finding meaningful employment. Some had been driven into exile, forced to leave their families and their homeland just to survive. Viscount Boyd of Merton escaped the judgment of his peers, and he escaped the judgment of the law. But he can no longer escape the judgment of history. The ledgers may have been burned, but the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always leaves a shadow.